So yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm going to be talking about innovation and improvisation in the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps in the First World War. So in 1917, the British Medical Journal published an article entitled "The Royal Army Medical Corps and Its Work." Over 2 weeks and 15 pages, the article traced the work of the British military medical services from stretcher bearing in the front line through to the care provided in military hospitals on the home front, concluding that, as far as the British people are concerned, the work of the Royal Army Medical Corps has given the greatest satisfaction, and it is believed that after the war, when details become known to those capable of assessing its more scientific aspects, it will be acknowledged that the Corps has taken full advantage of the opportunity offered for advancing precise knowledge of medicine and surgery, as well as the means of handling vast numbers of sick and wounded men. This early judgment of the work of the RAMC during the First World War has often been reflected in later analyses. For all its violence and destruction, the war provided the scope for medical advances across the globe, from the development of new techniques such as blood transfusions and plastic surgery, to new knowledge and awareness of illnesses, including tropical diseases and psychological trauma. Socially, the war gave vast swathes of European men access to medical care which would either have been unavailable to them, or which they would have had to pay for in civil life. As a result, according to the historian Fiona Reid, quote, "Men of all nationalities came out of the trenches with the firm belief that because they had gone to war, they deserved good state-funded medical and social care, not just during the conflict, but afterwards too." Those who provided medical care in wartime are generally remembered in heroic terms, with men like Noel Chavasse, the double Victoria Cross winner, held up as examples of wartime self-sacrifice, whose aim was to save rather than take life. This hagiographic interpretation of military medical services during the war has not, of course, gone unchallenged. Indeed, during the war books boom of the late 1920s, the image of the regimental medical officer to emerge from soldiers' memoirs was more likely to be that of a drunken bully ready to dose out medicine and duty, or the emetic No. 9 pill, than one of heroic self-sacrifice. Medical advances can also be read as ambivalent, often occurring in conditions that today would be considered not merely experimental, but unethically so. Leo van Bergen has argued that the failure rate of experimental treatments, such as injecting wax into the face of a disfigured man in an attempt to recreate a cheek, is reason to question the usefulness of wartime experiences for medical care in civilian life. New medical expertise was often far less relevant in other contexts than we might suppose, and it was gained at an inordinate cost. So how are we to understand the work of the medical services during the First World War, particularly in the British context? What I want to do this evening is look at medical innovation during the war, but from a slightly different angle from many previous histories. I want to concentrate on medical care in the front line, and specifically the care provided not so much by doctors who served as medical officers, but by the men of the ranks of the Army Medical Corps who served as stretcher bearers and nursing orderlies, usually with little or no formal medical training. In addition to looking at how medical innovations could both help and hinder these men in their work as providers of medical care, I will discuss their use of improvisation in their work. The combination of innovation and improvisation, I will argue, did indeed allow the medical services to make advances in skills and knowledge during the course of the war, although in ways more qualified than the British Medical Journal might have wished to acknowledge. The innovations and improvisations I will be looking at relate to both the treatment and transportation of patients. This reflects the two primary roles of the medical service in wartime, at least in the eyes of the military authorities: to clear the field of battle so as not to impede the advance of uninjured soldiers, and to return the sick and wounded men to health as rapidly as possible in order to conserve manpower. So a process of recycling men, which became increasingly important over the course of the war. Before turning to this discussion in detail, however, I want to give a quick overview of the system of evacuation which structured the work of the medical services for most of the war. I say most of the conflict because this system reflects the static conditions of trench warfare, which only really developed after the initial War of Movement, which came to an end in early 1915. It then broke down again during the Spring Offensive and the 100 Days campaign of 1918, when the return of rapid retreat and advance first collapsed and then strung out to breaking point, the line of evacuation. So how is a man wounded in the front line evacuated and cared for? In the first instance, he would be expected to care for himself, or a comrade would care for him, using a first field dressing, which I'll discuss in a little more detail in a moment. If he could walk, he would make his own way to a walking wounded collection point or the regimental aid post. If he couldn't, he would wait to be collected by a regimental stretcher bearer. I'm just, sorry, no, I don't have an image here. There's a distinction between the regimental stretcher bearer and the stretcher bearer of the Royal Army Medical Corps, which I'll come to in a little bit more detail. But a regimental stretcher bearer is a man of the regiment rather than the RAMC, who volunteers or is volunteered to give up his rifle and carry a stretcher during an offensive, and to go out and collect men from no man's land. The stretcher bearers of the RAMC were technically not supposed to actually enter no man's land, although this, of course, did not reflect the reality of battle. So the regimental stretcher bearer would carry a wounded man to an aid post located in or just behind the front line, where he would be given basic first aid and have his details logged by the regimental medical officer, who is assisted by one orderly who, like the regimental medical officer, was an RAMC officer, but a non-commissioned RAMC officer, usually a corporal. From the aid post, the wounded man will be taken, this time by the RAMC stretcher bearers, to a dressing station manned by the tent or nursing orderlies of the 1st Field Ambulance, to which the bearers were attached. Field ambulances were established RAMC units of 193 men, divided into 3 sections, each containing 36 bearers, 13 to 15 tent orderlies, and up to 3 wagon orderlies. And this term of field ambulance does tend to cause confusion among people who are not familiar with First World War terms. It is the establishment of men, not the vehicle. Vehicles are either ambulance wagons or motor ambulance vehicles. Orderlies ran the dressing stations, bearers provided the transport, and the wagon orderlies cared for the unit's kit. Depending on the distance from the front line, the wounded man might then be taken by a relay of field ambulance bearers through a number of advanced dressing stations before reaching a main dressing station. Excuse me, that's the main dressing station that I put up slightly in advance, which, as you can see, is slightly more substantial than a regimental aid post. At a dressing station, either advanced or main, he would have his wound redressed and could receive a hot drink and a cigarette if he was in a condition to do so, and there wasn't too much of a rush. Main dressing stations were sited near roads, and the next stage of the wounded man's journey would be by ambulance wagon, or increasingly by motor ambulance, to the casualty clearing station. Although an integral part of the medical evacuation process, motor ambulances were organized and run in convoys not by the RAMC, but by the Royal Army Service Corps, which also oversaw the work of volunteer motor ambulance units. Drivers in the convoys were mechanics rather than medical personnel. Motor ambulances were spaces of transport, not care, and often very dangerous ones. Traveling in poorly sprung vehicles over rough terrain was at best painful and claustrophobic. At worst, it could cause wounds to reopen, resulting in hemorrhage. Motor ambulance convoys were also at risk from shelling and accidents on crowded roads, where men and supplies going up the line were always given priority over those coming down, however badly injured those men were. The casualty clearing station, the name given to the next stage of the man's journey from the front line, was what had been known in previous conflicts as a field hospital. The name was changed in 1915 over military concerns. The public perception of these units was as spaces of long-term care, a hospital, rather than as stations along the line of evacuation. They were designed for men to travel through, not be held at. Ironically, the static nature of trench warfare meant that over the course of the war, they became increasingly less mobile and more hospital-like. Originally, they'd been designed as field hospitals to follow the line of an advance. Providing space for frontline surgery and the treatment for short illnesses requiring bed rest. They were staffed by their own establishment of doctors, orderlies, and trained military nurses of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service, the unit with the most complicated acronym in the British military. This was the closest to the front line that women were allowed to serve by the British military authorities throughout the war. Just as main dressing stations were sited by roads, so casualty clearing stations were sited at railheads, so that once stabilized, the wounded man could be evacuated by train. As I said, they're designed as through stations rather than hospitals. As with the motor ambulance convoys, trains were run by voluntary as well as military units, with the Friends Ambulance unit perhaps most notably running 3 trains through most of the war. Unlike the motor ambulances, they also carried a medical care provider in the form of a medical officer, 3 nurses, and a number of orderlies whose main responsibility was cleaning and feeding the patients, although they could also assist with mechanical problems. And there's at least one example of where the medical orderlies were required to get off the train and help put it back on the tracks after it derailed. So they were muscle. This was just as well as even short journeys could take many hours. As on roads, traffic going up the line was always given priority over that coming down. And an ambulance train, even fully loaded with wounded men, could be shunted onto a siding to let a train carrying reinforcements and munitions up to the line go past. Ambulance trains took wounded men to base hospitals, located at major ports, Boulogne, Le Havre, Rouen in France, Alexandria in Egypt, which were staffed by RAMC medical officers, trained nurses from the QAINMS, and the Territorial Forces Nursing Service, and British Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses on overseas service. Base hospitals were fully functioning military hospitals where men could receive longer-term treatment before being discharged to convalescent camps and ultimately returned to their unit. If, however, a man received a blighty wound, so serious that it would require complex surgery, longer-term care, or even eventual medical discharge from the armed forces, he would be transferred by a hospital ship for transportation to Britain. Once there, more hospital trains would take him to a home military hospital, also staffed by VADs and RAMC orderlies under the authority of an RAMC medical officer and a trained matron. And this is the example of the closest military hospital to the university where I work. Was number 2 Northern General Hospital, which took over the teacher training college at Beckett's Park near Headingley. At a home military hospital, the wounded man could receive specialist treatment. The Leeds Hospital expanded during the war to include East Leeds Poor Law Infirmary, which became a specialist dental unit for men with facial injury, and the main hospital at Beckett's Park after 1917 became a specialist orthopedics unit treating men with amputations. Before he would be discharged from auxiliary convalescent hospital, which would be run entirely by the British Red Cross, so was staffed almost exclusively by VADs, where he could be returned to military service, usually via a rehabilitative training camp, which was very often near some of the more established recruit training camps on the coast. So to summarize, return to this image, the treatment along the line of evacuation occurred in the spaces of care, the shapes on the diagram. Transport occurred along the lines in between. Innovations and improvisations can be found in both the shapes and the lines. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to discuss how the impact of such innovations and improvisations on the line of evacuation from no man's land to the casualty clearing station, the area that was predominantly the space of work for the men of the RAMC field ambulance. And I'm going to start with the technologies of first response and first aid. So these technologies weren't in and of themselves innovative. The first field dressing, for example, had been introduced during the Crimean War. It comprising a wool pad, a square of gauze, and cotton bandage enclosed in a waterproof jassanet. The dressing was designed to be used as first aid by any soldier. Similarly, the triangular bandage, which formed a key element of the surgical haversacks, medical companions, and fracture kits, which accompanied regimental medical officers in their work, had formed part of first aid practice throughout the 19th century. By the First World War, such bandages were a central part of St. John's Ambulance first aid, being viewed as a universal tool for the treatment of a variety of wounds and fractures. That's according to the training manual. As the St. John Ambulance had been providing first aid training to the territorial forces, medical services since the Corps' formation in 1908, as well as to civilian voluntary aid detachments, which would then go on to become part of the voluntary aid movement during the war, familiarity with this technology would have been nearly as ubiquitous as with the first field dressing. The innovations that these technologies represent, therefore, is the democratization of first aid provision and the medical knowledge associated with it during the war. Every soldier would have, at some point in his service, encountered a first field dressing, usually as he embarked for overseas service, when he was issued with it to be sewn into his tunic, and been instructed in its use, either as a padded bandage or as a tourniquet, although the thoroughness of such instruction varied wildly according to unit of service. Prior to the war, the medical profession had often been highly defensive of medical expertise, arguing that the social innovation represented by the first aid movement, driven by organizations such as the Order of St. John, posed a risk to accident victims. The spread of first aid technologies throughout the war served as a catalyst for the spread of knowledge of first aid practice and helped to settle the argument on the side of civilian first response. These technologies also drove economic arguments on the, also drove economic innovation in Britain to meet demand for the number of aseptic dressings required by the War Office. The Thackeray Pharmaceutical Company in Leeds invested in specialist technologies which would continue to be used long after the war, and this is only one example in one city. The uses made of first aid technologies also point to the importance of improvisation in frontline care. While men were supposed to be trained in the use of their field dressings by their regimental medical officers, they often used them in unauthorized ways, from applying multiple dressings to a single wound to substituting a putty for the cotton bandage. Puttees, it should be said, were probably the frontline serviceman's most important improvisational tool when it came to first aid treatment. As well as holding dressings in place and acting as tourniquets, they could substitute for the equally flexible triangular bandage as a bandage or sling for wounds, slings for broken bones, or for fastening a splint. And here you see from the training manual some examples of these are predominantly triangular bandages in the drawings, and the photograph is, I believe, 2 handkerchiefs and a first field dressing being used in improvisational style. Puttees also had a role to play in the improvisation of transport by both regimental and RAMC stretcher bearers. Laced between 2 rifles, puttees could form a webbed stretcher. A greatcoat attached between rifles by the sleeves could form a more conventional stretcher base. The most commonly used form of transport improvisation in and just behind the front lines, however, was undoubtedly the manual carry. These are from the St. John training manual, where the bearer used his own strength, sometimes combined with that of a comrade, to transport the wounded man. So important were these forms of improvised transport in the disrupted and shifting landscape of the battlefield that the training manuals used by the RAMC formalized them as part of the instruction given to recruits to be learned alongside the more formal stretcher drill. Unfortunately, they don't provide pictures in the official RAMC training manual, just reams of text, which doesn't make quite such a good slide. One of the reasons why such transport improvisation was so important, particularly on the Western Front, was due to military innovations in trench design, which developed throughout the war. Particular innovations which proved problematic for stretcher bearers were the zigzag trench and, from 1917, the twin trench. The zigzag trench, which was designed to prevent any invading enemy from gaining a clear shot down their length, introduced tight corners, which were physically impossible for an army pattern stretcher 1 foot 11 inches wide and 7 foot 9 inches long, including poles, to negotiate around, as you can see here. As a result, as the British Medical Journal noted, it is common for the problem to be solved by lifting the patient on a blanket or on a stretcher over the parados or back wall of the trench and carrying to the regimental aid post over the intervening ground. Such a practice took bearers and patients out of the safety of the trenches, leaving them exposed to the risks of both shelling and snipers. Twin trenches also limited maneuverability of stretchers, as they could be nowhere wider than 24 inches, with the average width of a fully developed trench not more than 4 feet at the level of the shoulder. Its course is invariably disrupted by angles, again, around which an ordinary stretcher cannot be carried except by tilting. Trenches located where the groundwater was low enough to allow a trench depth of over 6 feet, meanwhile, may have provided excellent protection for the men in them at the expense of only 3 layers of sandbags. But they were designed to be dug at such an angle that, as noted above, the bottom was only 2 feet wide and at ground level 4 feet. Stretchers could not be physically carried along such trenches, even at shoulder height, again forcing bearers and their patients to leave the comparative protection they offered for open ground. As we've seen, stretchers were improvised throughout the war, but there was little in the way of innovation in basic stretcher design, certainly nothing to keep up with the innovations in trench design. The results were at best problematic and at worst life-threatening for wounded men and the bearers who carried them. If trench design made the transportation of the wounded more perilous for patients and carers alike, one innovation which was of unequivocal benefit to the patient was the Thomas splint. Introduced to standard military medical use in 1915, the Thomas splint, named for its devisor, H.O. Thomas, was designed to separate the ends of the bone in a leg fracture to prevent bone hemorrhage caused by friction in transport. That is, the ends of the bone rubbing together would prevent the bone from clotting, the blood vessels in the bone from clotting, and could lead to hemorrhage. The splint was, in short, a simple form of mobile traction. For bearers, they added weight to an already heavy stretcher. For men suffering from leg fractures, a not uncommon wound due to shrapnel injuries, they were lifesavers. Following their introduction, fatality rates from such wounds dropped from 80 to 15%, which is one of the most dramatic statistics of the entire war. In fact, so effective is the basic design that a variation of the Thomas splint continues to be used by military medics on battlefields. And about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, I spent some time at the Heaton Park the experience field, speaking about medical innovations alongside a current Army medic who was demonstrating the use of the Thomas splint that he had been issued with in, I believe it was Afghanistan. The Thomas splint is arguably the most effective and long-lasting medical innovation to be disseminated by the First World War. I think it was technically invented shortly before the war, but certainly the war causes it to come into popular use as a form of combat treatment. The effectiveness of the Thomas splint as a treatment can also be seen in the extent to which bearers improvised Thomas splints, as well as other forms of splint to aid with transport. A volume entitled The Soldier's First Aid, published in 1917, and this is a private publication rather than an official publication issued by the War Office, describes how to manufacture one out of a rifle, a bayonet scabbard, and the ubiquitous puttees, so things that a man would have had on him when wounded. While actual Thomas splints were issued to regimental medical officers to be applied once men had been transferred to the regimental aid post, the ingenuity of the rankers who acted as bearers enabled application of this life-saving treatment further forward in no man's land. Innovation thus combined with improvisation to save lives and alleviate pain and discomfort in transportation. A similar reliance on skills, knowledge, and ingenuity of the men of the ranks engaged in care provision can be seen in the treatment of shock, the most common condition suffered by wounded men. And this is shock not as an emotional trauma, but defined by the 1911 Military Medical Training Manual, which formed the basis of RAMC training during the war. Shock was a condition produced by severe injury or emotional disturbance. The man suffering from shock becomes pale and cold. He lies in a semi-conscious and helpless state, the face pinched, the lips ashy, the temperature subnormal. Cold is the most common symptom. The pulse feeble or absent. He often breaks out into a cold sweat and may have fits of shivering or be restless. And shock is very often, medical shock is very often caused by hemorrhage. So prevalent was shock as a condition that RAMC rankers were trained specifically in its prevention and treatment. According to the 1918 pamphlet, The Treatment of Wounded Men in Regimental Aid Posts and Field Ambulances, regimental stretcher bearers should be instructed in the gentle handling of patients and in the application of splints. Rough or unnecessary treatment must be avoided as one of the most potent factors in precipitating shock. They were also to be made aware of the danger of wound shock and taught the urgency of preventing unnecessary loss of body heat during the carry back to the aid post. Loss of heat was both primary cause and signifier of the loss of physiological coherence, identified by the nursing historian Christine Hallett as the definition of shock during the war. The stretcher bearer's chief weapon in the battle against shock, therefore, was the humble army blanket. According to the authors of The Treatment of Wounded Men, the chief protection of the wounded man against cold during the first part of his journey lies in the liberal use of blankets. At no time is the loss of heat more rapid than during the first 2 hours after wounding, and every effort must be made to prevent exposure to cold at this period. Nothing is more striking than the deterioration in condition that takes place when a stretcher case has been started on his journey without a blanket beneath him, as well as one on top. In cold weather and with shocked cases, a third must be added, And this is the diagram that accompanies these instructions, showing how to wrap a man in 3 blankets to prevent shock. The pamphlet advised that regimental stretcher bearers should be supplied with a certain number of waterproof sheet blanket packets, each packet consisting of 1 blanket wrapped in a ground sheet. These are strapped to the stretcher ready for use and returned to the regimental stretcher bearers as soon as they have delivered the wounded man to the aid post. The occasional loss of a blanket will be amply compensated for by the saving of wounded men who would otherwise die from the effects of a carry on bare stretchers. The authors of the pamphlet go on to provide 3 pages of instructions on how to effectively wrap a patient for transport, as well as a further 9 plates on keeping patients warm and dry in the often insalubrious atmosphere of a regimental aid post and dressing station. Such advice while well-meaning and certainly useful for regimental stretcher bearers and regimental medical officers, could be somewhat problematic. Regimental Medical Officer Colonel David Rory noted in his memoir, An Officer's Luck in the War, that it was difficult to make suitable arrangements for dealing with blankets and stretchers soaked by the rain and mud from the long carry from the front line. When the casualty clearing stations were at last awake to the fact that blanket drying was not a troublesome sideshow, but an important factor in combating shock up the line, we had taken a step forward by which everyone benefited. So there was tension between the different medical establishments over how to ensure that medical advice was carried out. For bearers and nursing orderlies, however, the constant requirement for clean, dry blankets created an additional workload in terms of both recording the movement of these items so that they couldn't be hoarded by one unit, as Rory accused the casualty clearing stations of doing, and transporting them back to where they were most needed. As with splints, the need to keep patients warm to prevent shock provided opportunities for improvisation. Motor ambulances, for example, were modified so that by the end of the war, heat from the engine exhaust or radiator water was being transferred to the interior of the car via pipes. I've read about this in a history of the motor ambulance. I have yet to see a diagram of how this actually worked. I'd be fascinated to see this. An even more Heath Robinson-esque contraption was the aid post sterilizer. This is possibly my favorite image from this talk. Fashioned out of 2 biscuit tins, a tea tin, a petrol tin, a butter tin, and a Primus stove. This particular improvisation reflected growing emphasis on the practice of asepsis, which also drove innovations such as the Carroll-Dakin method of antiseptic wound drainage, introduced as standard practice in British military medicine by 1917. There's a little bit of unclarity about exactly when it becomes standard practice, but it is certainly the case that it is standard by 1917. While undoubtedly life-saving, the Carroll-Dakin method was also time-consuming and labor-intensive. It was only possible to practice such methods in static sites of care where men could be held for a greater period of time. The casualty clearing station was thus the furthest forward such care could be given, with most occurring at base hospitals where it could be performed by nursing VADs, such as Vera Britton, who describes her experience of conducting Carroll-Dakin drainage. Yet improvisations such as the biscuit tin sterilizer allowed developing medical knowledge about asepsis to shape medical care, even in the more difficult conditions of the front line, particularly the regimental aid post. Away from the cold and mud of the Western Front, medical innovation was often driven by the landscape. While infrastructure posed challenge for medical transportation in Europe, with pavé roads causing wounds to open in motor ambulances, as I mentioned earlier, and single-track rail lines creating delays for ambulance trains, in Egypt and Palestine, the lack of infrastructure provided an even greater challenge. While train lines did exist, including one between Alexandria, the site of the main hospitals, and the military base at Kantara, there were no roads through the desert across which 3 years of campaigns were fought, or very limited ones. Evacuation by motor ambulance was impossible, and manual carries across the vast distances involved too exhausting to contemplate seriously. The solution was the ship of the desert, the camel, with patients strapped on either side into cassoles, which could be used either sitting or lying down. Now, unfortunately, this form of transportation was by some way the least popular of any used by the medical services anywhere during the war, and that counts on all fronts that I've read about. The camel's nickname is well earned. Many men found themselves suffering from seasickness on top of their wounds while being transported by them. The cassoulet also appear to be about as painful to travel in as motor ambulances on a pavé road, if you believe some of the memoirs of men who did travel in them. As a result, many medical officers serving in these theatres of war spent a great deal of time thinking up alternative forms of transportation. There were records of experiments with wheeled stretchers and sand sleighs, which met with mixed success, although W.D. Fothergill recalled that during the trek across the Sinai Desert, we had sledges drawn by mules to carry the sick and wounded. However, only one transport innovation appears to have worked: the wire road, described by Charles Ammons as mesh chicken wire pegged down at the edges, which fulfilled its purpose admirably of keeping wheels and feet from the surface. In Fothergill's recollections, such roads were made of ordinary rabbit netting on top of the sand, of which he succinctly noted, "It worked." So to conclude, the First World War was undoubtedly the context of medical innovations in both treatment and transportation. Such innovations were not, however, unambiguously beneficial, even if they were, unlike most military innovations, designed to save rather than take lives. They, along with advancing medical knowledge, could make life more complex and difficult for the men on the ground tasked with undertaking care and transportation in and immediately behind the front line. In response, these men improvised, sometimes in ways which placed their own lives in danger, such as leaving the trenches to carry stretcher patients with greater ease and comfort. The significance of these innovations was twofold. In transportation, they aided the effectiveness of swift evacuation while limiting discomfort, re-emphasizing the medical military priority of keeping the front line and trench system clear of wounded where possible. However, improvisations also brought developing knowledge of medical treatments and their effectiveness closer to the front line in the form of first aid and aseptic practices. In the case of first aid, such developments helped in the process of democratizing medical care, as suggested by Fiona Reid. The men of the ranks of the Royal Army Medical Corps, who were often the drivers of improvisational practice, thus had as important a role in defining how the First World War affected medicine as the nurses, doctors, and scientists who we tend to remember today. Thank you very much indeed. And I will now stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Jessica. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And if everybody would like, in what's fast becoming a bit of a tradition, care to raise your hands on the old control panel underneath, just to show our appreciation. Unfortunately, Jessica, you can't see that yourself, but I can see all the attendees' hands going up like that on a control panel that I've got here. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
In the absence of an audience, you can see that substitutes for applause. So thanks very much indeed for that presentation. We've got some questions in now, and I'd invite people to type the questions in on the control panel underneath, although I also believe that possibly the control panel might be up there if you're on a different, if you're on an iPad, so forgive me if I'm pointing to the wrong place, everybody, but you'll see a Q&A icon underneath. So let me now, just as I'm burbling along, just to give people chance to ask the questions, let's just have a quick look at some of these questions. Fire away, you're live.
Fascinating talk. I mean, it's a pity, as they always are. I've studied a fair bit on the American Civil War. What experiences did the Royal Medical Corps use from previous conflicts on a Boer War, American Civil War, to try to brace themselves for what might happen on the front? I mean, I think in particular, I believe the system of triage was developed by, I think it was a Colonel Reynolds on the Union side during the Civil War, and that, I believe, is still very much with us today.
Yes, so it's a very good question. There appears to have been quite a lot of relearning rather than learning. going on. So triage gets adopted by the French during the First World War before the British take it on, and the British then learn it from the French medical services. They don't seem to have looked to previous conflicts directly. The South African War does have a lot more effect on British military learning, but a lot of that takes place before the war because the medical disasters in South Africa lead to an inquiry that then gets specifically aimed at the medical services, that then gets folded into the Haldane reforms and the creation of a specific territorial forces medical service with its own training program. So the RAMC is in some ways has learnt the lessons of South Africa in terms of organization, but then it tries to employ the medical techniques appropriate to the South African landscape and sorry, I'm blanking on the word, you know, the South African climate, excuse me, to the climate of the Low Country, you know, to Flanders, and that doesn't work because you're faced with different illnesses very often. So the lessons are mixed, but there's perhaps less learning from previous conflicts than one might have hoped at the beginning of the war.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Stephen. I'm just muting you now, so let me just have a look at the next question. Jane Potter, I'm unmuting you, so if you'd care, Jane, to ask your question. You're now live, Jane.
Okay. Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. You'll probably know what my question's going to be. Fabulous on sort of the mechanics of how everything worked and so illuminating. But I wanted to know if in the memoirs that you looked at, say from stretcher bearers and so forth, whether they make any hints at or discuss the emotional effect of that work on themselves. If you could just maybe say a bit about that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Jane. I do write about that in my book, An Equal Burden. It wasn't the focus of this talk in particular, but yes, men do, perhaps not as directly as some of the medical officers do. A lot of the men of the ranks of the Corps are working class with lower levels of education who are perhaps less comfortable with the sort of middle class self-reflection than many of the medical officers might be. You get some very interesting examples. A lot of them do keep diaries, however, during the war, because as a non-combatant unit, they do have more time behind the lines. You know, they're not in the front line if they're with a field ambulance. So there's sort of more time in the evenings. They're not sat in a dugout in a trench in the front line quite as much. And a lot of them do keep diaries, and even if they're not explicit about some of the traumas, you do find a lot of evidence in the language that they use in those diaries of the emotional burden that they carried in caring for men, and the deep sense of responsibility they felt. So losing a patient can cause real upset to these men, even if they only knew him for the relatively brief period of carrying him from the front line to the main dressing station. If they then find out he's died, they will often reflect and express deep upset at this because of their sense of responsibility. So there is evidence in diaries and to a lesser extent in memoirs of this.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Jessica. Right, Catherine Humphreys, I'm going to ask to unmute you there, but I suspect you might not be able to.
Oh, I can now.
Are you okay there, Catherine?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can just.
Hello? Brilliant.
Hello? Yes.
Sorry, I was trying to eat my tea at the same time. No, I just wanted to ask, I'm currently studying Masters in the First World War, and trying to find a dissertation topic, ideally, but I wondered if you thought, what's the most important innovation of the First World War medicine, if there is one?
Yes. The Thomas splint is the short answer. I need that the fall in fatalities is so dramatic that, you know, if you had to pick one, purely on the numbers, that would be it. But more generally, I'd say that the movement of treatment closer to the front line, and you can see that it happens across pretty much every type of wound and illness, that regimental medical officers get increasing levels of expertise, which they can then apply in the front line. But the clearest example is actually the treatment of psychological trauma, where for the first 18 months or so of the war, men diagnosed as suffering from psychological trauma are sent all the way back to Britain, which it turns out actually embeds their trauma. Whereas if they're kept closer to the front line, even if they're kept with their units until the initial experience, the initial breakdown has passed, you know, if the unit can be brought out of the line relatively soon after the breakdown and they're in rest, then men tend to recover. That doesn't mean they don't then break down later on, but for the military purposes, they can recover sufficiently to carry on serving. So that idea of treating in the front line, giving the regimental medical officer quite a lot of say in what sort of treatment should be applied, rather than shifting everything back and having a very top-down structure to medical services, is probably one of the big innovations that my understanding from medics today still shapes the way in which medical services are provided in the military today.
Thanks very much. Sorry if I get the impression that I'm looking like I'm not focusing on what you're saying there, Jessica, but do apologise. It's I'm just doing the admin in the background. So thanks for answering that. Richard Crompton, unmute. There we go. Richard, you're now live.
Good evening. Wonderful. A completely new area of experience. I'm following on from what Jane said, and when I've asked my question, when you finished answering, I'll give you a conclusion to what happened to my relative. He landed at Anzac on the 25th of April 1915 as a stretcher bearer with the 2nd Australian Field Ambulance. He served through the landing, the battle at 400 Plateau, 2nd Krithia, where there was a 3,000-yard carry, and finally at Lone Pine, all without relief. In October 1915, he was evacuated to Mudros with enteric. Later in Alexandra, it was pyrexia of unknown origin. There were many symptoms I would associate with shell shock, an unrecognised illness in the days of Gallipoli. Have you any knowledge of the incidence of shell shock amongst stretcher bearers?
That actually speaks to my current research, which is looking at the pension files of British servicemen, where a diagnosed illness is acknowledged by the state and given a pension. And there is quite a high incidence of the RAMC as a unit of service turning up in those. I'm not at the stage with that research to give numbers, however. And the official medical statistics of the war don't break down by unit what men were diagnosed with. They just give the sort of overall numbers. And it's been a while since I've looked at the shell shock and psychological trauma numbers, so I can't remember what they are off the top of my head for Gallipoli. The other thing I should say is when it comes to Gallipoli, I would point you to my colleague, Alexia Moncrief, who has just written a book on the history of the Australian medical services, including at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, which has just come out with Cambridge University Press, which would give you a lot more information on your relative's experience than I can do. Shell shock psychological trauma is a complicated illness. I've written fairly extensively about it because the language used around it is very confused. Different term, so shell shock itself is banned as a term. It's initially introduced by Charles Myers in 1915. It's then banned by the military because it's so evocative and it's seen as causing men to use it to malinger. And they introduce the term not yet diagnosed nervous. Soldier's heart can be used. Pyrexia of unknown origin actually refers to fever, so it probably means that he was running a fever. There would be a physical symptom involved there. But it's untangling some of the diagnostic terms around psychological trauma is very complex in the First World War because it's so many different terms are used in so many different ways. It can be quite hard. Looking at individual cases, as in the case of your relative, I suspect we can make some sort of retrospective diagnosis based on our understanding, but that's always a little bit dangerous. For the historian in me gets a little nervous about that.
Tom did spend 50 years and 2 months in Mont Park Psychiatric Repatriation Hospital in Melbourne, where he died.
Yeah.
But that was subsequent to an incident at, crikey, I've forgotten what battle it was. Another battle. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you. Right, Jane, I'm going to unmute you now. Jane, you're now live.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I am ex-RAMC. I was wondering about the dissemination of knowledge during the war. So, a useful improvisation is found by one unit. How do other units and other areas of conflict get to hear about it? Obviously, something like a Thomas Splint was then issued, but other things, how was information disseminated?
Yes, so the medical journals continue, including not just the British Medical Journal. I believe there's an RAMC medical journal that starts during the war, shortly before the war, possibly. So medical officers, particularly those serving in casualty clearing stations and base hospitals where there's quite a lot of strictly medical innovation and specialization, cardiology becomes sort of defines itself as a specialism during the war, the study of heart disease, anesthesia, and the use of x-rays similarly. They will publish articles in these journals that then often get picked up by the higher ranks of the Corps, who then identify the most useful innovations and disseminate them through orders to other units. Otherwise, you're looking at word of mouth. I think the wire netting in the desert was just this one medical officer or unit informing another that they managed to get this to work. So it's variable, but there is a sort of traditional method of disseminating medical innovation and medical knowledge, and then more improvised methods as well, which are less efficient.
Thanks for that, Jessica. Graham Hodge, asking you to unmute yourself. Graham, you're now live.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, Jessica. Just a quick question from me. How important were canals and barges to evacuating the sick and the wounded? And were the barges fitted out or equipped in any special way?
Thank you. when I started my research, I thought they were going to be very important. They don't appear to have been that important. I think they're slightly limited as far as the medical services are concerned, because they mainly apply to Flanders and bits of France rather than being something that's used all over. Whereas trains, you can build train tracks pretty much anywhere, and they do build train tracks in most theatres where the British Army fights, and therefore affect services. And then in places like Gallipoli, hospital ships are the most important form of transport rather than barges. So they're limited by, you know, loss of canals from the 18th century onward. What little I do know about them is that, like hospital trains, they were specially equipped, but they weren't built to order. They were adapted from stock that existed, and as a consequence, like a lot of hospital trains, they were very cramped, particularly getting enough lying down cases. I'm sorry, the other place they are used is in Egypt, where they're used less for transport than they are to extend hospital accommodation. And they put the members of the Indian Army end up on at least one hospital barge that sinks. And I'm sorry, I didn't actually write about it, but there's a bit of research from about 5 years ago now, that I'm just trying to remember the story. They tend not to play a huge role in transportation, and consequently there's some wonderful images in the Wellcome Library collection of hospital barges, but not a huge amount of written material or records of hospital barge service that I encountered, but there may be more there that I didn't find.
Thanks for that. Right, who's next? Simon Barber. Let me unmute. Simon? Simon, you're now live. You're now
Hello.
live. Hello there.
Hello.
Hello, Jessica. Thanks very much for the talk. Very interesting. I just wondered if you could comment on Noel Chavas as an atypical regimental officer, in many ways, not the least that he seems to have disobeyed the very strict instructions of not putting themselves in danger.
Yes, I'm not sure that Chavas was atypical in the not putting himself in danger terms. In theory, what's supposed to happen is that the regimental medical officer in an offensive stays in the aid post so that he is there when the wounded are brought into him, rather than running around no man's land trying to find the wounded. He is supposed to be the point of treatment that men are brought to. So it's less about trying to get medical officers to not play the hero than it is to make medical care giving and during an offensive as efficient as possible. That being said, there are most of the medical officers who write memoirs will at some point say they've gone into no man's land, put themselves, gone beyond their remit and put themselves in danger. And of course, being in the front line is dangerous from shelling anyway. So in that sense, I don't think he's necessarily atypical, but regimental medical officers are hugely varied as characters, more so than any other group of men I've looked at during the war, to be honest. They vary from men like J.C. Dunn, who is the medical officer for the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, who is incredibly rude about Siegfried Sassoon in his memoir, to David Rory, who ends up as a colonel and presents himself as incredibly responsible. He serves in the war as a major. They're very different personalities. They're all doctors, so they all have a certain amount of self-confidence, shall we say, which I think doctors tend to need to to be good healers. And I think that would be about the only thing I could say that makes a medical officer typical in any sort of way. These were young men with a lot of self-confidence and a belief in what they were doing.
Sorry, my apologies, Andrew. Just I've not. Just want to unmute yourself. There, you're live. Yeah.
There we go. Hello, Jessica. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I just have a simple question, really. I've read of a method called bismuth iodine paraffin paste used that superseded the Carol Dakin cleansing method, but I don't know whether it did really or whether it ran in parallel and it was a frontline treatment. I don't know what the method is myself. I wonder if you could explain the difference.
I've never encountered it, to be honest. Yes, that sounds to me like something that ran in parallel. If it was a paste, it sounds like something that could be. So Anna Carden-Coyne's written quite extensively about the scientific debates in these medical journals that went on in the development of Carol Dakin, with all the problems that it had in terms of being time consuming and getting the mixture right, because it's a mixture of antiseptic liquids, and then the delivery method took a while to develop. So I'd have to go back to her book to see if there was any reference to a parallel method developed at the time. But there were other forms of aseptic treatment being developed at the same time that Carol Dakin was. I just know that Carol Dakin became the accepted method from 1917 onwards in casualty clearing stations and behind. But there certainly could have been other forms of treatment being engaged with in parallel.
Yeah, as you say, I just think that being a paste method, it probably was more stable the nearer the front line you were than a sort of irrigation method.
Yes, I will now go and look for that. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that. Thank you. So, there we go. Kate Thompson. Kate.
Hi, thank you very much. One of my grandfathers was a stretcher bearer, and he would talk about the war, but sod's law, I didn't become interested till after he died, and I'm having great difficulties finding out anything about his service apart from the material in the National Archives. Is there anything I'm missing?
So the RAMC Muniments collection was collected by the Corps and held in Farnham at the Regimental Museum. It was then in, I can tell you, 2010, 2011, it was digitized by the Wellcome Library and is now freely available digitally online. So it is worth going online to the Wellcome Library and looking for it's RAMC Muniments, and it's a range of things. It covers South Africa right through, so it runs from 1895 and the foundation of the Corps as a Royal Corps right through to the present, but there's a huge First World War focus in there. So there's a lot more information in there. And it is available during lockdown on your computer.
Thank you very much. I shall be at it tomorrow.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Right, John Dixon.
Good evening, Jessica. Thanks very much indeed for the talk. Can I firstly make a brief comment? You've just mentioned Dr. Dunn and Second Royal Welsh Fusiliers. I don't know whether you've ever done it, but it's interesting to read his book against Robert Graves and Frank Richards, all of whom were in the same battalion.
Yeah.
So you get Richards was very keen on Dr. Dunn.
Yes.
The question really was, my wife and I were listening to what you were saying about the work of the stretcher bearers. Any information from your research on how they were able to handle gas casualties?
I think it depended on what type of gas. The the only sort of specialist information I found, other than the training they were given in shock, was their treatment of men with abdominal wounds. Because it was the stretcher bearers who seemed to have been the first to realize that moving men with abdominal wounds was incredibly dangerous, and that you mustn't give them anything to drink, because that will kill them. And that bit of observation seems to have trickled up rather than being trained down. I haven't found anything specific about the treatment of gas cases. Most of the information is from the nursing orderlies, the tent orderlies, who very often find themselves in regimental aid posts, or in advanced dressing stations, which then suffer from gas, and they have to stay there. They have to stay there and treat men, and a lot of them suffer from gas injuries and from the psychological trauma of a gas attack. And that, to go back to some of the earlier points, does emerge in their narratives. I don't recall any specific training that they received or observations that they made about how to treat gas cases versus any other type of illness or injury.
Okay, Jessica, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Very much. Right, Marie McCarthy, just asking you to unmute yourself there. Hello, Marie, you're now live.
Hello.
Hello.
Jessica, thank you. That talk was excellent. I have a particular interest in wound care, and I'm researching Irish nurses in World War I. And I was wondering, in your research, did you come across the use of sphagnum moss, which I know was collected in the bogs in the south of Ireland by volunteers in huge amounts to be used as a dressing in lieu of maybe a more orthodox dressing? And I believe it has antimicrobial properties.
Yes, I have. It was also collected around Sheffield, so not far from where I do my research. And I actually did one of the BBC World War I at Home programs was on sphagnum moss, which I did some of the advising on. Yes, it gets used. It doesn't get used overseas. It tends to be used at least in Britain, in England, it tends to be used in the home hospitals, so that the produced, the aseptic treatments produced by companies like Thackeray are then sent to the War Office to go overseas. So that tends to be what is shipped overseas, and the sphagnum moss is used in treatment of persistent wounds on the home front. Principally. I'm not sure how well it travels, is the thing. I don't know how fresh it needs to be. I haven't found any information on that, but that certainly seems to be what happens in England from my research. But yes, it is, and you get one of the ways in which local communities are asked to support their local war hospital. They're asked to collect eggs and donate eggs, to provide entertainments and to come and visit the men in hospital, and also to go out and collect sphagnum moss for wound care.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Peter. Peter West, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Peter, you're now live.
Thank you, Jessica. Very interesting presentation. I think you've already touched on this subject, but one thing I found looking through some of the manuals written later in the war is there's very little coverage of what was one of the major changes in the First World War, which was the introduction of chemical warfare with, chlorine and phosgene earlier on, and then specifically the debilitating effect of vesicants like mustard gas in 1917. And how did the RAMC adapt to these amazing changes in warfare as it had been known for hundreds of years?
Well, I think the point you make about mustard gas is a lot of these are debilitating. A lot of the suffering caused by chemical weapons is the debilitating nature of the wounds and illnesses that they cause. So for the field ambulance, for the RAMC field ambulance, even for the casualty clearing stations, they're there to evacuate men, to move them through, to treat them. They don't hold them for extensive periods of time. So some of the adaptations in treatment, the responses to those sorts of new forms of warfare are most obvious in the home military hospitals, where medical officers do study these men. The comparator would be perhaps facial injury, with the specialist hospitals developed, for instance, at the Queen's Hospital SIGCUP. And the amazing work that Harold Gillies does, which is huge medical innovations in plastic surgery around facial disfigurement due to increased artillery power and shrapnel wounds. So in that sense, the men that I studied don't really need to respond to some of the more terrifying military developments, because the innovations are related to the long-term disabilities that they cause. Where they do respond, as I say, is this moving of care closer and closer to the front line, which just means survival rates go up, and more men survive more major injuries than would otherwise have done, due to the improved expertise of a large number of men able to provide first response care and to stabilize them and to get them back to where they can be treated in innovative in ways that respond to these new developments. So it's not quite as clear cut as saying that the men that I looked at respond to particular types of weaponry that develops, more that they are part of a wider medical process of response.
Thanks for that. I'm just going to do two last questions. I'll come to Linda Payne last, but we'll just go to Brendan Hogan now as the penultimate question. So, Brendan, I'm just unmuting you. Brendan, you're now live.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. So I just have a quick question for you. Are you aware if the BF made any effort to record casualty statistics in general terms for specific battles by mechanism of injury? So for example, like a particular battle, like 60% of the casualties were caused by shell fire, 10% by gas, so on and so on. Or if so, where do those records exist? Thank you.
It's not quite as granular as that, but there is a wonderful volume. Mitchell and Smith's The Official History of the Great War, of the Medical Services of the Great War, The Official History of the Great War, Medical Services and Statistics. And William Mitchell was a RAMC officer, and Miss G. Smith, whose first name I don't know, was the statistician who compiles the statistics of type of injury. The breakdown is, it's a 800-page volume, so they do breakdown of theater, of type of injury, of date, of specific battles. They don't necessarily do cause of injury or illness. So it isn't quite that granular, but there's a huge amount of statistical information in there. It is possibly the most important book that I looked at during the course of my research, and remains such. And you can get a facsimile version, I think, from the Imperial War Museum bookshop still.
Thank you.
So I recommend that one.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your question, Brendan. Linda, last question from Linda Payne. There we go. Oh, hang on, sorry. I think let's just try. Right, Linda, I think you're now live. No. Try again. Let's. Linda, we can't hear you. I think your microphone may not be working on your PC there, Linda. Let me just, I want to ask you to unmute and we'll just have one more try. Right, go ahead. No, we can't hear you, Linda. I know what Linda's question is, so Linda, I'll just read out your question for you. Linda asked, at what point was surgery carried out in the triage system and who by?
That's interesting. This is, again, this point about treatment moving further forward. The surgery can be carried out as close to the front line as the casualty clearing station. And the Imperial War Museums has, because it went on exhibition up at the Imperial War Museum North at one point, a lovely example of a frontline operating table, which was used in the casualty clearing station. And it's tiny and it folds up and it looks so fragile, and you can't imagine a full-grown man having surgery done. But yes, most men would have had their first surgery at a casualty clearing station, and then probably further surgery going back at base hospital. And then of course many men, particularly those with amputations, would have had many further surgeries once they'd ended up at home.
Right, thanks very much. There's a load more questions, but it's now 9:20, so frankly I think we're going to have to call that an evening. Jessica, on behalf of everybody at the Western Front Association, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your time and answering in such detail so many questions. So thank you very much. For everybody else who's watching, I hope you've enjoyed this talk by Jessica. If you're not a member of the Western Front Association, please do join us. You'll be joining 6,000 or so like-minded people who all have a common interest. And whether or not you are a member, the next presentation will be on Monday evening at 8 p.m. when we'll be talking about the tank Deborah at Flequier. But Jessica, once again, sincere thanks for your work tonight and for a wonderful presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me and for facilitating the discussion, David. It's been fun.
No worries. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks everybody for joining, and everybody's turning the videos on and waving and clapping, so thanks very much for that. Thanks very much and good evening to everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières.